Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are unpacking the incredibly wild, totally paradoxical life of a man whose name is practically a synonym for wealth itself, John D. Rockefeller. We're talking about history's very first billionaire. This is a guy who completely, fundamentally reshaped the physical and economic landscape of modern America. But, to really understand him, we have to look at this massive, almost unbelievable dichotomy between his absolutely ruthless conquest of the business world and his eventual pivot to becoming a pioneering humanitarian. It's a crazy story, so let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really get what made this titan tick, you have to understand the trauma of his childhood. John absolutely was not born into wealth or privilege. No way. He was born in 1839 into a deeply unstable family, and honestly, that was largely thanks to his father, William Rockefeller. Or, as the locals literally called him, Devil Bill. Bill lived this chaotic, double life. He just vanished for months at a time, leaving his family hungry and totally broke, only to suddenly roll back into town in a luxury carriage handing out gifts. And how did he fund this? Through a secret career as a traveling con artist, selling totally useless herbal remedies under a fake name.
And Devil Bill's parenting style? Well, it was exactly as ruthless as his street cons. The guy actually bragged, saying, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make them sharp." Think about that for a second. With a father who was constantly running scams and who eventually just abandoned the family entirely to be a bigamist, young John was forced to become the adult of the household before he even hit his teenage years. He had to be the rock. He had to provide stability where there was absolutely none. So all that extreme anxiety and poverty, it forged this ironclad, super rigid discipline in John. He learned early on that he had to control every single variable he possibly could, and that right there is the defining trait of the empire he was about to build.
That relentless, burning drive brings us to September 26, 1855. John is just 16 years old. After pounding the pavement 6 days a week for 6 straight weeks in Cleveland, he finally lands his first job as an assistant bookkeeper. He was making roughly 50 cents a day, but to John, man, this was everything. It meant actual independence from his chaotic father and literal survival for his mother and siblings. In fact, for the rest of his entire life, he celebrated this specific date as Job Day. He treated it with way more enthusiasm and passion than his own birthday. He knew, deep down, that this single job was the bedrock of everything that was going to come next.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because that childhood obsession with control became the literal foundation of his business philosophy. When Rockefeller entered the oil industry, it was booming, sure, but it was incredibly chaotic. And Rockefeller, he despised unpredictability. So he executed a playbook that we can basically break down into 4 C's. First, basic competition, right? Which just drives prices down. But Rockefeller hated the waste of price wars, so he preferred cooperation, basically trying to fix prices with others. Well, when that inevitably failed because competitors got greedy and cheated, he escalated to consolidation. He started horizontally integrating, just buying up rival refineries left and right. And finally, he reached the holy grail, centralization, total vertical integration. He didn't just refine the oil anymore. He owned the pipelines, he owned the barrels, the land, the retail shops, the whole shebang. Every single step of the process was his.
To achieve that kind of total control, Standard Oil engineered tactics that were, frankly, nothing short of warlike. He secured these secret railroad rebates and even things called drawbacks. This meant the railways were literally paying Rockefeller a cut of the fees his own competitors were paying to ship their oil. It's wild. And when that wasn't enough, he created the first corporate trust so he could legally control competitors without technically owning them. He'd swoop in and buy up all the available refining machinery, all the oil barrels, just so his rivals couldn't physically package their own product. And then he'd aggressively undercut prices until those competitors just financially bled out.
All of this ruthless efficiency culminated in the event that history remembers as the Cleveland Massacre of 1872. In a tight 6-week period, Rockefeller used the sheer, terrifying threat of a massive, secret railway alliance to squeeze his rivals. He'd literally open his books to them, showing them mathematically that Standard Oil could outlast them all in a price war. Then he'd give them an ultimatum: sell out to me right now or go bankrupt later. Your choice. In just a month and a half, he absorbed 22 of his 26 competitors in Cleveland. Just swallowed them up.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer, terrifying scale of what he created. By 1879, Standard Oil didn't just run Cleveland. They controlled roughly 90% of the entire oil refining industry in the United States, and by extension, basically the world. Just pause and think about that for a second. Imagine a single company today controlling 90% of global computing or 90% of global agriculture. There's almost no modern comparison. It was an absolutely unprecedented, staggering monopoly.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive contrast between Rockefeller's shadow ops approach and the era's other great titan, Andrew Carnegie. You had Carnegie, the Scottish steel magnate, who was loud, published his philosophies, operated transparently, and obsessively focused on lowering production costs. But Rockefeller? Methodical, secretive, operating deep in the shadows. Carnegie built the world with steel. Rockefeller powered it with oil. They had this bitter, distant rivalry going on. But here's the thing. They both shared this uncanny, genius-level ability to see pure opportunity where everyone else saw only ruin.
Nowhere was that clearer than during the Panic of 1873. A massive, crippling financial crisis hit the United States. The stock exchange actually shut down, railroads collapsed, and a staggering 18,000 businesses just failed, completely wiped out. But while everyone else was terrified, retreating, and desperately pulling back their money, Rockefeller and Carnegie? They advanced. They used the economic crash to go on a shopping spree, buying up distressed assets, steel mills, and refineries for absolute pennies on the dollar. They understood better than anyone that crisis creates the ultimate opportunity for those bold enough to seize it.
Rockefeller's incredible ability to just operate above the daily chaos is perfectly captured by his famous belief: he who works all day has no time to make money. Now, that sounds totally counterintuitive, right? But it completely reveals his fiercely calculating mindset. He didn't want to get his hands dirty out there drilling for oil. That wasn't the goal. He wanted to sit back, architect the massive big-picture structure, and control the flow of the entire industry. By pulling himself out of the daily physical grind, he gave himself the mental bandwidth to construct a literal, unassailable empire.
And let's be clear, that empire completely reshaped how you and I live today. Before Standard Oil came along, kerosene was wildly inconsistent. Sometimes it wouldn't even burn, and sometimes, worse, it was so volatile it would literally explode in your living room. Rockefeller standardized the quality. He made it safe. He made it affordable. And in doing so, he literally lit up American cities, extending human activity well into the night. And then later, when electricity came along and threatened the kerosene market, Rockefeller seamlessly pivoted to a previously discarded byproduct, something called gasoline. Standard Oil just completely transitioned to fuel the birth of the modern automobile era. Talk about staying ahead of the curve.
But look, monopolies of this astronomical size, eventually they hit a wall. After years of mounting public outrage, fueled by these tenacious muckraking journalists and the aggressive trust-busting policies of President Theodore Roosevelt, the hammer finally dropped. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled under the Sherman Antitrust Act that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly, period. The Great Octopus was officially ordered to be dissolved and shattered into 34 separate, independent companies.
But here's the ultimate irony of that historic decision. It's what we can call the breakup paradox. The government's forced dissolution was supposed to be Rockefeller's great humiliating defeat. Instead, it ended up being the single most profitable event of his entire life. Because, you see, he retained his massive shares in all 34 of those newly spun-off companies. Companies that went on to become giants you know today, like ExxonMobil and Chevron. And the combined value of all those independent stocks? They just skyrocketed, multiplication by division. This forced breakup actually tripled his net worth, officially crowning him as the world's very first billionaire.
And that brings us to his absolutely astonishing third act. With more wealth than any single human being in history had ever possessed, Rockefeller basically retired from the business of making money and dedicated himself entirely to giving it away. He personally donated an unprecedented $540 million during his lifetime. He completely pivoted from being the ultimate ruthless corporate conqueror into a systematic global savior, quite literally creating the template for modern large-scale philanthropy. And he didn't just build vanity monuments to himself either. He focused deeply on medical research and public health. A prime example is the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission. Between 1909 and 1914, his foundation tackled this devastating hookworm epidemic that was just ravaging the American South. They went in, surveyed 11 states, and discovered a staggering 40% infection rate in those populations. 40%. And then they fully funded the massive public health initiatives and treatments needed to combat the disease. They saved countless lives and totally transformed the health standards of the entire region.
So the crucial point is this deeply paradoxical legacy he left behind. John D. Rockefeller was a man who legally, yet absolutely ruthlessly, choked the life out of thousands of competing businesses. He amassed his wealth through intimidation, fear, and secret backroom deals. Yet,
he turned right around and used that very same monopolistic blood money to eradicate diseases, build world-class universities, and advance human health on a truly global scale. So it leaves us with this fascinating, really provocative question. Do the philanthropic ends of curing disease and advancing humanity somehow justify the ruthless monopolistic means he used to acquire that wealth in the first place? It's a heavy debate, and honestly, it continues to define our understanding of capitalism to this very day. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. And remember to always keep questioning the history that built our modern world.